MacVoices is sponsored by MintMobile. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, this is a topic we touched on in a previous MacVoices, but I wanted someone that had a little more skin in the game and a little more experience than our previous discussion. And that's why Paul Kafasis is here. Paul, it's good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How about you, Chuck?
I'm good. Rogue Amoeba is humming along. You seem to be just updating and releasing things on a pretty consistent basis right now.
Yeah, I just last week published our status report. We do an annual status report in January, usually in January. I guess this year it managed to slip to February. But talking about the almost 50 releases we had last year and what we're looking to do in 2020. So it was a good chance to sort of have an overview of what we're going to be doing this year, and now we need to actually execute and do it.
This is not the topic we're going to be talking about, but 50 releases?
Well, so we've got 7 products, and if we have a bug that's in the back end of one of those products, suddenly we need 3, 4, 5 releases, one for each of those products. So yeah, it's not too hard to add up to at least one release a week or so, but keeps us busy.
Yeah. Well, and it says a lot about you and about your team that you find those bugs and you squash them that quickly that you do 5 releases a year, if as necessary, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Paul, the topic I was alluding to is the announcement that Apple, it looks like, is either doing it or going to allow licensing models that would let a developer sell both the iOS, iPadOS, and Mac versions under one license for one price.
Right.
And this has gone back and forth. I've seen a number of articles about it. I know I've had a couple discussions about it. I was curious as a developer to see how you felt about it, because I can think of both pros and cons for both the consumer and the developer. And you've had you're kind of an outspoken commentator on the App Store model and versus the direct sale model, and I mean that only in a positive sense.
Sure.
So, how do you see this?
Well, for us at Rogue Amoeba specifically, I don't think it's really going to impact us at all. We have one product in the Mac App Store, and we have one product in the iOS App Store that they're not the same product, so it's not something that we would sell together. So it's definitely something that when I looked at it, I said, all right, let me sort of think about this and analyze it, but it's not something that is going to directly affect us at this time. But looking at it, broadly as a software developer in general, it's something that it makes perfect sense for Apple to do. They might as well do it. They have these multiple platforms. You alluded to 3 platforms: iOS, iPadOS, and the Mac. But I think it's reasonable to lump iOS and iPadOS into one. That's the same App Store. But you've got the iOS platform and the Mac platform, and recently they've made it possible to have apps that it's not as simple as people think it is, but you can make one app and ship it for multiple platforms for both those platforms. So the idea of then making it possible to purchase that same app with one click and have it download to your Mac and have it download to your iPad or your iPhone or both certainly makes perfect sense. As far as looking at it from a developer's perspective, though, I don't know how much sense it makes if you're trying to sell a product. Because if you have a free app, great. Again, somebody clicks get, or I think it's the get button now, because it's not the buy button if it's a free app. So you click get and it'll download to whatever platform you're on. And if you have your settings set the way I think they default to, it'll also download on your Mac if you just download it on your iPhone, whatever. So for a free app, that's great. But if you're trying to sell a paid app, it doesn't necessarily make sense to sell one lumped product if you don't know that users are going to use it on all those platforms. So I think the economics of it make more sense that if you say, okay, we have a Mac version and we have an iOS version, and some people are going to use one, some people are going to use the other, and some smaller subset are going to use both. Economically, it makes more sense to charge $10 for the Mac version, $10 for the iOS version, and people can buy both if they want to, instead of charging more for the lump package. You're either going to have to charge customers who aren't going to use both, and they're going to overpay, or you're going to have to lower your price and you're going to lose money on the sale. So again, from a developer's perspective, sort of my brief takeaway was that I don't know if this makes a whole lot of sense for paid applications.
Okay, you hit a number of things there that I want to touch on. So
it was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Well, but it's a good answer. It's a good answer. So let's go back to one of the first things you said, and this is one where I have no experience. How easy is it to develop for one platform and then port to the other?
Much more difficult than Apple makes it out to be. How about that? Okay. I mean, so at WWDC in 2019, 6-8 months ago, they announced Catalyst, which was their method of developing iPad apps and bringing them to the Mac. So there's a whole lot of apps that have only been made for the iPad, and there's not a native app for the Mac. So I think Netflix is a pretty good example. I think there's a Netflix iPad app, but there has not been a Netflix Mac app. Obviously, you can use your web browser to watch content, but that's not quite as good as having a native application. And so the Catalyst system is designed to make it easier for developers to say, okay, we have an iPad app, we're going to bring it to the Mac, and it's not tremendously difficult. It's certainly not as difficult as starting from scratch a new Mac app. But we've also seen the results of these apps on the Mac in both 10.14 and 10.15 in Catalina, and these apps have not been great. Apple's own apps. There's a Home app for the Mac now. There's the News app. I'm trying to think what the other ones are. But the apps that Apple made basically using this Catalyst system have not been super great Mac apps. It's certainly better than not having an app. So if you want the Home app, say, you'd rather have a crummy Home app than no Home app at all. But it's not a great system for creating a sort of a top-notch product. So I think we have not actually used Catalyst to do anything with our own products, but I've looked at it plenty, and it's not terribly difficult. It's not incredibly difficult to use to bring your iPad apps to the Mac, but you don't get a great result out of it. Is sort of what I would say. But to answer your question, how difficult is it? It's not terribly difficult. It's not super easy. Apple definitely tries to out it. You check one checkbox and suddenly you're, maybe a few hours later you've got a Mac app, and that you have something that can run on the Mac. But there's still a whole lot more work that you're going to want to do to improve it and make it really sort of fit in on the Mac.
So does that have to do with the fact that iOS, and we'll refer to that to include both iPad and sooner or later those two I think are going to fork a little bit, but that's a whole other discussion. Is it because of the touch interface with the iPad versus the mouse interface with the Mac?
That's the touch versus the mouse is a big part of it. So certainly the very first Home app in 10.14 had a scroll wheel. And on a touch device, that's great. You just go like this, you flick your finger, and suddenly you're looping through times or numbers, whatever you're trying to do. It doesn't really fit on a mouse-driven interface. There's also the fact that the Mac is designed to show dozens of windows, and iOS has always been all about showing you one window. The whole screen is one window, and the Mac has had a full screen mode for years at this point. But most apps are not designed to be running full screen. It's sort of a secondary thing. And so the Mac has always been about, and the other half of that is that the iPad has split screen now. So you can run two apps at once. But these are sort of baby steps towards being like one another. But right now, it's fair to say that the iOS devices are mostly built to show you one thing at a time, and that's it. And the Mac is definitely built to show you, multiple apps at once, and you can click between windows, and you can go from, right now I've got our video chat up, and just to the right of it, I've got a few notes that I took. And then I've got some other stuff in the background, and I didn't have to do anything special to make that happen. I just have two windows open, multiple windows open. So I think it's the touch part of it is a sort of an obvious way that they differ, but also there's just sort of the mindset of, on iOS, my app is going to be the focal point. That's it. Everyone's going to be looking at this if they're using the app. And on the Mac, it's, I might be in the background. What am I doing there? What are my windows doing there? Do some of these windows hide when I'm in the background and some of them stay visible if someone wants access to some of the content? And there's just a lot more that you need to think about in terms of multitasking, basically.
Okay. You've articulated the developer point, I think, very, very well. And I've been trying to figure out what other advantage, what the advantage would be or disadvantage. The only thing I can personally come up with is that if I'm a developer who wants to have a little mini ecosystem with my app, so that it, let's just assume that it syncs through something like iCloud, and so that I've got it running on both platforms, that might be an incentive, an advantage, that if I have purchased a license for program A on the Mac, that it automatically will go to my iPhone or iPad, or vice versa. And so, but I still have to price it, accordingly.
Right.
And then flip over to the consumer side. Maybe I'm paying for something I don't have an iPad, I don't have an iPhone,
Right.
but I have a Mac, or again, vice versa. And so I'm paying for something I really don't need. And I'm not sure people will necessarily think that much about it, but it means that you've got to put a higher price on it to compensate you for your time.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think the more granularity you have, if you can say, okay, we're charging for the Mac version, we're charging for the iOS version, and if you need both, then you purchase both. You can save money for those people who only want the Mac version or only want the iOS version. And if you can't do that, or if you choose not to by doing this sort of bundled product, then yeah, you need to price it such that you're factoring in that some of these people are going to use both products. And if you price it higher, that means some people are going to be paying for something that they're not necessarily using. That's true even just making one application. An application has 50 features and people use 5 or 10 of them. So you're always paying for something that you're not using. But this is something where, it's a whole different platform. And up till it's actually not possible to do this yet. This is coming, we think, probably next month. So at present, the only way to do this is to buy 2 separate apps, and it works just fine the way it is. So it's not as if there's something here that has to be solved. So from my perspective, to your point, I don't know that there's any huge advantage to this for anybody, really. When I stop to think about it, the whole point of the app stores is that it's super easy to get an app, right? You click one button or you tap one thing and your payment information is already in there. So then it authenticates you, with Touch ID or Face ID. But it's, how long to download an app? 15 to 30 seconds maybe. So if you need to do this on 2 different platforms, you've saved 15 or 30 seconds. It's not as if, you might, when you buy something from our store, it takes, it's pretty quick, but it's, a couple minutes. You have to enter your credit information, things like that. So if you buy something once and then later you say, oh, you know what, I need the iOS version of this as well, and you need to go back and buy something, it's actually a little, there's a couple minutes worth of time that you're spending there. With the app stores, it's supposed to be ridiculously easy, and it is ridiculously easy. So the fact that you've eliminated, 15 seconds of work is not necessarily that valuable in terms of having this universal download and purchase.
Yeah. So let's flip this around and ask the question: what is the benefit here? I think I'm fascinated by it because of all the different models we're seeing. There's still the controversy over the subscription models, and so people are trying variations on the subscription models, and we've talked a million times about that here with different developers and their particular flavor of it or their motivation. And so with this one, I kind of try to figure out what is the motivation for Apple to do this, and what's the motivation for a developer to adopt it.
Right. Well, I mean, the motivation for Apple, as I said very early on, it makes it easier for users to get products. So even if it's only just a little bit easier, it's not really going to hurt Apple any. I guess the only way it could hurt Apple is if the developers have to charge less for that universal than they would for 2 separate products. So if you had 2 separate products and they were $10 each, and instead you charge $15 for this universal download, Apple's 30% will be less than it would be on 30% of $20. So there's a slight risk there, but I think Apple doesn't need to worry about that anyway. And I think it's eliminated by the fact that this will make things a little bit easier. So I think that sort of offsets it. So for Apple, I think it's literally just, we're making this as easy as possible. And even if it's only, a few seconds easier than it was. It's still easier, so that's better, and that's all they really need to care about. For developers, like I said, if you have a free product, this is great. Again, one click and it'll be on all your platforms. And if these products talk to one another in such a way that you really get more benefit from it being on multiple platforms, then it'll be very obvious how that works for users. They don't need to go and make a separate download and set it up separately, things like that. For a paid developer, though, like I said, it's not something we would use. It's not something that I've seen a very obvious reason why you would use it. So I don't necessarily have an answer for that one.
MacVoices is supported by MintMobile. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/MacVoices. I'm a big fan of doing things better and cheaper, but only if it really is better and it really is cheaper. That's why Mint Mobile really got my attention when I found out that I could get their cellular service for $15 a month. The question was, is it as good or better than what I'm using? I didn't want dropped calls or lack of coverage or limited data plans or all of those other things that can be a real pain when you're trying to get things done. What I found was that with Mint Mobile, my coverage was at least as good, sometimes better, than my old plan from one of the big carriers. Their data plans can be had for 3, 8, or 12 gigs of 4G LTE data, and I get to keep my old phone and my old number, and all my contacts stay in place. What I didn't get was having to pay for the overhead that the big carriers charge you for: kiosks, mall stores, and staff that are glorified order takers. Mint does business all online to keep the costs down, but the service is right up there with the big boys. So do yourself a favor. Go to mintmobile.com/MacVoices and cut your wireless bill to $15 a month. That's $15 a month for great coverage and lots of data without giving up your phone or your number at mintmobile.com/MacVoices. Thanks to Mint Mobile for their support of MacVoices.
Yeah, and the logistics of how assuming a developer adopts it, the logistics are going to be interesting because right now I pick up my iPhone, I just say I want to buy or get or whatever, double click the one button and that's it. The process is similar, not exactly, but it's similar on my Mac. But if I do it on my phone, is it going to somehow automatically download or become authorized on my Mac, or will it automatically download to my Mac, which is something that not quite sure I'm completely comfortable with that idea.
If you actually want that, yeah.
And vice versa, same thing with my iOS device. That especially if it's a large app, I might not want to. So, does it download only when I'm on Wi-Fi? There are a lot of permutations here that I'm anxious to see how it works and how seamless they can make it.
Yeah, well, I think I haven't looked at the settings very recently, but there's always been settings for like content, like music and audiobooks and movies, where those are obviously cross-platform content. So if you purchase a song, I think there's an iOS setting that'll say, download all purchased songs, and I think there's probably a Mac setting for the same thing. So if you buy it on one platform, it'll show up on the other ones because that's how you have it set, and that's the default. And you can definitely turn that off as well. But I would assume that for apps, it would do something similar where probably the default will be, just download it to every platform that I have. And that's just how it'll work. I guess I don't know. Right now, if you download an app on your iPhone and you have an iPad, does the default automatically download? And then is there a setting that will allow it to automatically download? I think there's at least a setting such that it'll show up. But I don't know if it's the default or not.
That's a great. I was going to say that's a great point, and I honestly hadn't thought about the comparison to music and movies and audiobooks, or books or audiobooks. So that's a great question.
Yeah, so I'm looking, at my settings in the iTunes and App Store settings. There's automatic downloads, and it's music, apps, books and audiobooks, and app updates. And it just says automatically download new purchases, including free, which isn't really a purchase at all, but that's made on other devices. So basically, if you have these settings on, and if you have the apps setting on, it'll download. If you download on your iPhone, it will then download on your iPad as well. I currently have them all turned off, but I don't know what the default settings are. So I think that's probably what they'll use for the Mac and iOS apps as well. But I guess we'll see in a few weeks.
Yeah, and I hadn't even thought about that because I have my phone obviously, but I have a couple of iPads that are configured differently, and I don't want everything coming to all the iPads. So
I think it's a per device setting. So I think if you have one iPad that is more of a test device that you don't want this stuff showing up on, I think you can just turn it off on that specific device and it won't download to it.
Yeah.
Obviously, we should look this up, and I'm sure listeners and viewers can correct us later. But I think that's how that works.
Yeah, well, frankly, you brought up a comparison and a part of it that I really hadn't thought about from that standpoint. Interesting. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it makes either app store any more appealing or less appealing, because it didn't sound like this is going to be a mandatory thing. It's going to be just an option that they're giving developers.
Well, what's interesting about it is that it's based off what's called the bundle ID, which is basically sort of how an application refers to itself in the background. So a bundle ID for one of our products is com.rogueamoeba.audiohijack. So that's it's supposed to be a unique identifier for the application. So no one else would use a com.rogueamoeba prefix for that. So you never have another application, even if an application had the same name, like a notes app multiple apps might be called notes, but you'd have com.apple.notes and you'd have com.other software company .notes. So this bundle ID though is for the universal package to work on the app stores, the apps have to share a bundle ID. And traditionally up till this point, you would have said com.rogueamoeba.audiohijack.mac, com.rogueamoeba.audiohijack.iOS. So you'd have two. So the applications, even if they were very similar or almost identical, but just on different platforms, the bundle IDs would be different. And this is sort of a wonky detail, but it's relevant because by default, most applications have separate bundle IDs, even if they would want the software to be bundled universally, like they're describing. You'll actually have to the developer will actually have to change that bundle ID so that multiple versions of the application share the bundle ID, and that's the only way that the software will be downloaded to multiple platforms. So all that is to say that by default, most of this stuff won't happen. Even if you're using a tool that has a Mac and a version, the developer will have to do something actively. So it's not just something that won't be mandatory by the app stores. It's something that won't even happen unless a developer actively, goes ahead and makes some changes for this, for the most part.
Now, you said that's a wonky detail, and I think it is, because this is something that most users would never see unless they would go and look.
Oh, right, exactly. So for users, it potentially will even be confusing, because let's say you have whatever notes app and you've got it on your phone and there's a Mac version. You might think, okay, well, it should just download automatically now because these are bundled together, but they won't unless the developer has actually made that change so that the bundle IDs are shared.
Okay. Yeah, those are the kind of details behind the scenes that we don't see, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to ask someone that is a developer and knows.
Sure.
What are the logistics of implementing this? And you say you've looked at it, but you don't plan to do anything. And of course, with Rogue Amoeba's stance on the App Store and the kind of apps you develop, it's probably not appropriate. So,
right.
Yeah. Okay. And any other thoughts on this, or any observations from your perspective, Paul, that I don't have the expertise to even ask about?
Well, I don't think there's too much of that, but I think it's interesting that this is something that's happening. What is it? This is happening in 2020. The Mac App Store was it 2011? It's almost a decade old. The iOS App Store is over a decade old. These two platforms have existed next to each other for a decade. iPadOS is right now, as you said, very similar. They haven't really forked very much, but that's supposed to be a third platform. But right now, it's really just iOS. So we've had these 2 or 3 platforms for a decade, and only now has Apple decided, you know what, maybe we want to make it possible to just one click or one tap download to multiple platforms. So I find it interesting that this is something that they're doing right now, as opposed to 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. This could have made sense back then. I think the obvious answer to that, or why they're doing it right now, is what we talked about earlier with Catalyst, and that's a tool that will make it such that iPads come to the Mac, and such that apps can be developed once and with some amount of extra work brought to multiple platforms. Whereas before, 5 years ago, you definitely had to have your iPad app and your Mac app, and they were two separate apps, and they could be similar, but they were not at all coming from one source. So I think that's the short answer for, why are they doing this now? But at the same time, it's easy to look at it and say, why didn't they do this 5 years ago or even 10 years ago? And now it's relevant because it's relevant because now you've got 10 years of people saying, okay, I'm going to download something for the iPad, and then maybe I'll look and see if they have a version for the Mac. So users aren't trained to think, hey, maybe this will just show up on multiple platforms, or maybe it'll work on multiple platforms. So I'll be interested to see just how much traction this gets. I mean, we're talking about it. I've seen a lot of discussion about it in the past few weeks since Apple announced this, but I don't know quite how much it'll actually get used in practice.
Just for the conspiracy theorists and the rumor mongers out there, do you think that this has any kind of indication that the two platforms are moving together?
I mean, first of all, that's a great concern, grave concern for us, because we're a Mac-focused software company, and the Mac has had, for 30 years, has had far more freedom. 35 years, wow, 36 years, has had far more, freedom and accessibility for the types of tools that we make, and it just wouldn't be possible to do what we want to do on iOS because of how locked down it is. So I think for years, for 5-10 years, we've been concerned that that's what's happening, and watching for signs that that's what's happening. I don't think that this is an indication of that. I think the past couple of years, Apple has tried to make it clear that they view the Mac as this platform and iOS as this platform, and they're two separate things, and they want to keep them two separate things. And I certainly hope they keep them two separate things. But the ability to Catalyst and then these universal bundles, both, I think, more point towards them wanting it to be easy to move between the platforms for developers, less than them wanting to just merge them into one platform. Catalyst, is something that you do because you want to bring software from the iPad to the Mac, not because you want to just merge the two platforms into one. 5, 10, 20 years from now, it's certainly possible that they'll say, you know what, we've made the platform similar enough that now we really are just going to combine them into one. We'll see what happens. But I don't think that this is any real indication that that's happening imminently or even anytime terribly soon.
I would hope not. And somewhere in there, you made me think of the discussion about locking down the Mac platform to the degree that the iOS platform is locked down. And certainly there are some advantages for the unsophisticated end user, but there are also some huge disadvantages for the moderately sophisticated user. And so I would not think that'll happen on the Mac side. On the iOS side, that's the way it was built, and that's probably the way it's going to stay. And if you're foolish enough to jailbreak, then you can do some other things with it. But please don't jailbreak, folks. If you listen to this show, don't jailbreak your iOS devices.
Because I haven't had a jailbroken device in probably 5 years at least. But early on, the first 3-4 years of the iPhone, I would have a jailbroken device, and that's a time when the iPhone was a lot less capable. I think if you were able to survey this, I don't even know how you could, but I would bet that jailbreaking has gotten far less popular in the past few years as the iPhone has gotten more and more capable. But early on, I found that to be tremendously useful. So I'm interested that your advice is simply to avoid it entirely.
My advice is to simply avoid it entirely, mainly because of the security issues.
Sure.
That, again, if you're Paul Kafasis, go ahead and jailbreak the daylights out of it and have some fun with it. But if not, you probably don't know everything that's potentially out there or potentially is happening to your phone. And the last thing you want to do, now that the phones have become so much more they're such an important part of our life, and not only is our email and our written communication, but our photos, your access to your finances. I mean, I can go on and on. It's 5 years ago that wasn't the case. Now, I think you want something like that locked down and behind Apple's security as much as you can. But
no, I think that makes sense. It's just as I said, I haven't jailbroken in many years at this point, but it's interesting to think about. I wonder who is still doing it even, and to what end.
Yeah, which, I mean, judging by the things I read, there are plenty of people that are very interested in it. Although the tweaks that they want to do are so minimal, it's just almost like, okay, I want my screen to flash yellow and green because I can, not because it really is useful. So, yeah. Paul, thank you. This, like I say, I've been fascinated by this. I think just again in relation to the licensing models, and wanted to talk to someone that knows a little more instead of just throwing opinions around. So, thank you.
Absolutely, glad to talk to you.
Do we have any news we should let people know about with Rogue Amoeba, or any product announcements or anything coming that we can share?
Well, I mentioned that status report, which is if people are users of any of our products, that's worth checking out, and if they're not, they can learn about the products. So that's on our blog right now. I think it's our latest blog post. In that report, we talk about some work we're doing on Audio Hijack, which is our most well-known product for recording audio. So we're doing a lot of back-end work right now, or behind-the-scenes work, I should say, that will hopefully see the light of day later this year. And just a bunch of updates to all our stuff that is always the case. So nothing. I don't need to shill anything in particular, I don't think.
Okay. All right. Well, I have to say, and I'm not just saying this. About 10 minutes before we were recording this, I was using Fission for a particular project, and so
excellent.
Folks, if you haven't checked out Rogue Amoeba or don't know about their products or all the products, you really should go and check it out. I guarantee you there's one or two that you're going to find will be of use. I promise. RogueAmoeba.com, Paul, is that correct?
Yep, but also MacAudio.com is what we got a few years ago because it's way easier to spell than Rogue Amoeba. So MacAudio.com.
Great. Good to see you. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Chuck.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Voices. Let us know how you feel about this. Did we miss anything? Is there something that you see as a major benefit or a major detriment to this new licensing model? Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching.
Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with Mac Voices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you Mac Voices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.